It's ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Ticklish Business, a podcast all about celebrating and honoring old Hollywood. As always, I'm your host, Kristen Lopez, and we are celebrating the Apple TV release of the new limited series of Cape Fear. Yes, we decided to make it into a limited series, but it was an opportunity for me to finally talk about the 1962 original version of Cape Fear, and to do that, returning to the show, and that is the lovely and amazing Emily Edwards. Emily, how are you?
I'm so good. I promise I will not stalk your family.
Exactly. You gotta love that when things just take a hard right turn into murder and mayhem. But of course, before we get into that, we'd love to remind everybody that social media, we are at Ticklish Biz, unless it is Twitter, where we are at Ticklish_biz. Be sure to throw us a like, share, and subscribe over there. We are on all podcast apps, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We would love a review in 2026, so consider leaving us one because it would be awesome. And of course, I'm always on the interwebs at Kristen K. Lopez, unless it's Instagram, where I'm at Kristen Lopez 88. And my site is thefilmmaven.com. It'd be great if you subscribe there as well. And my new book from TCM, entitled But Have You Read the Book? Romance Edition, drops July 28th. And if you pre-order that and then upload your receipt to the publisher's website, you get 3 months of paid subscription to my newsletter, The Film Maven, for free, plus a tote bag. Who doesn't love tote bags? That info is all over my social media, as well as at thefilmmaven.com. And of course, the Patreon keeps the lights on at Ticklish Biz HQ and lets me do all sorts of fun things, like the YouTube episode we just did with Samuel Garza Bernstein about Roddy McDowell for Pride Month. It's going to help get me through the TCM Festival audio that I know I am very behind on, but that is coming, I promise, as well as some other fun things we have going on. Some of our great patrons, including Chris McKay, Sean Goudreau, Ali Moore, Richard Silver, people I'm just naming off the top of my head. All of you are incredibly awesome. You help keep this show going for 10 years strong. I cannot believe that. I think our 10-year anniversary actually is in the summertime, right around this time. So it's been great to still have so much support. Head over to patreon.com/ticklishbiz. You can subscribe at just $1. We just did our first Zoom mixer, which was a lot of fun. We talked about classic film. You get all sorts of fun stuff, including our Secret Santa exchange at the end of the year, which is really, really fun. Head over there and check it out. And our YouTube, doing more stuff over at YouTube, at youtube.com/@ticklishbusiness. We have all sorts of video over there, including my interview with Sean Hepburn for Rare, and my interview with David Zucker. A lot of fun things over there. So I think we finally have gotten through all of the housekeeping. Yay! Let's talk about Cape Fear. This is a 1962 film directed by J. Lee Thompson, based on the novel The Executioners. It stars Gregory Peck as Sam Bowden, an attorney who has recently testified against a man named Max Cady, played by Robert Mitchum. He testified against him for sexual assault of a young woman. Max Cady went to prison and believes that he has been wrongfully sent away, and thus returns to terrorize Sam and his family, including his wife Peggy, played by Polly Bergen, and his young daughter Nancy, played by Laurie Martin, and murder and mayhem ensues, as it usually does. Emily, had you seen either iteration? Because there's a 1962 version of this, and then Martin Scorsese remade this in 1992.
Yeah.
So, had you seen either version before this?
No, I hadn't. I am chicken, and for some reason I was always under the impression that this was far more of a slasher movie for some reason. Certainly maybe because of the Scorsese aspect of it, where his movies are really very viscerally violent.
This one's, the remake is a lot more hyper violent. It's almost too much to watch in some scenes.
Yeah, so I have a feeling that my brain, because 92, I was 6? So, I've probably registered it more as a sort of slasher movie than something that is straight up my alley, which is Southern Gothic, noir, which is incredible. And so I was really happy when you asked me to guest on this, because I'd been meaning to watch it. Is literally on my list of like, you have to watch this to stop being so culturally illiterate. And I was like, finally, I get to do it. And yeah, it was great. It is just a great freaking movie.
Yay! I'm so happy. I'm so happy. Well, it's ironic that you bring up thinking that this was more of an old school horror film, because I can tell you that the first time I heard about this movie, I want to say it was one of those like sci-fi AMC scariest movie lists, back when they actually cared about like actual scary movies, and not just name dropping stuff that was recent at the time.
Yeah.
And they included this film, and I think especially the third act swamp sequence. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll give this a watch. And I watched this original one, and I absolutely adore it. It's one of my favorite Robert Mitchum performances. I mean, tied for first, I think, with
Yeah.
Charles Lawton's Night of the Hunter, which again, playing a very, similar, like sexually aggressive type of character in a different film. And it's just such a fantastic representation of the 1960s, in the sense that where we commonly identify more later 60s films, something like, In the Heat of the Night, as more indicative of the 1960s. I feel like Cape Fear kind of is that first little chink in the armor of things are not okay. The 1950s are ending, and that idea of halcyon safety is starting to crumble. I have seen the 92 film, and we'll talk about the distinctions, throughout the episode between this film and that film. The 92, it's Scorsese. It's great. It's a very different movie, though. It's a far more, because they can be more open with the sex and actually talking about assault and stuff like that. It makes some choices with certain characters that I don't 100% agree with. But again, we'll get into that. But I think the original Cape Fear is just an utterly, utterly brilliant movie. I mean, to start, this has an interesting production history. Cornell Wilde originally got the rights to the novel back in 1958, and I'm so glad he did not make it, because as most people know, I hate Cornell Wilde. No offense to the Cornell Wilde lovers on this podcast. He does nothing for me. He is a bar of soap that is a man. That's it. I know it does nothing for me. Of course, at the same time, Gregory Peck had his own production company, Melville Productions. They had made The Big Country and Pork Chop Hill. They purchased the rights, I guess when Wilde couldn't make the film, and they wanted to make it after Guns of Navarone, and that's how J. Lee Thompson gets involved, because they had worked together on that film, and Gregory Peck hired him. And J. Lee Thompson does not get his flowers, I think, as a filmmaker that he should. Predominantly an English director, had started out making a lot of movies over in England. Started with some, stuff like Murder Without Crime, Young and Willing, and then he makes Tiger Bay in 1959, which, Emily, if you're looking for something kind of akin to this, but less rapey, for lack of a better word.
Say psychosexual, if you will.
Tiger Bay is interesting. I watched it recently for the first time, and it's a somewhat similar story in the sense of there being a criminal, more of a misunderstood criminal, I think, than anything else, though, and a young girl at the center of it, that being a very young Haley Mills. It was her breakout role. And he did really great with that, and that kind of brought him his ticket to Hollywood, and he makes Guns of Navarone with Gregory Peck in 61, makes Cape Fear, and then just starts making big movies. He was the director of 1964's What a Way to Go, which I keep saying we're going to do an episode on that movie soon, and we have not. And I'm always surprised when I remember that he directed that film, because it does not seem like a J. Lee Thompson film. Does Eye of the Devil, McKenna's Gold, eventually gets to Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, and then does Battle for the Planet of the Apes.
Everybody needs to pay their mortgage.
And yeah, eventually I think just kind of starts ending his career doing like, you know, Chuck Norris movies.
Yeah.
Kind of an ignominious end to a pretty fascinating career. But I think that his direction is really good. Because I feel like you need kind of that outsider vibe. Just
Talking at you. But I know I was reading up on this, and he was very intent on making this a Hitchcock-esque movie, which I think works incredibly well, especially when you remember Hitchcock in his notorious sort of noir heightened suspense movies and slightly less of the flashy North by Northwest Hollywoody kind of movies. And I think it really sings so well. You know, he made the decision to shoot it in black and white, which really adds to the ambiance and the overall feeling of watching the movie. I think that if it had been in color, it might have ended up looking cheesier, a little bit silly, a little bit lower budget. You know, I think obfuscating the scenery and things like that with the black and whites and allowing that extremely high contrast on screen, especially when you do have Mitchum, who's lighter hair, lighter eyes, very stocky, and Gregory Peck, who has that extreme contrast between his hair and his skin because of his heritage. Like, it works really well on screen in a black and white movie. And this is it's shot in a way that makes you feel like it's an ultimate black and white movie.
I think the noirish elements of it are so necessary to get around some of the perceived problems that the censors might have had with it at the time. This is a movie that is very sweaty, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean it's the threat of sexual violence is always omnipresent, but it's also just a very like horny movie too, and
Yeah.
not consensual, but like Robert
No.
Mitchum's character is always there's always a double entendre. There's always this concept of sex permeating things,
I
and then when you get
mean,
to the third act, and there's he's wet. There's eggs involved. There's all these different things.
it's gooey.
I think that the contrast in the black and white makes it stand out, but I think it also had to be a way to get around some of the censored like concerns of like, well, if you're not really able to see it, maybe you won't notice it.
Yeah, definitely removing the color of flesh from the movie. I mean, within two scenes, Robert Mitchum's walking around in his underwear in a room full of men, basically like literally puffing out his chest and basically like threatening everybody in the room. And he's supposed to be so vulnerable in that moment because all these cops are basically asking him to strip and so they can search his clothes for weapons and drugs. And he's the most powerful person in the room, even though he's standing there in his underwear. And if there had been any tone of skin, like actual living, breathing skin, like in that scene, it would have been so too sexual for 1962 that there's no way it would have gotten past American censors at that point. Like, there's absolutely no way. And leaving the sort of little girl character with, she's always dressed in white, she's never dressed in any other color. The wife is almost always in very, very pale colors. They're really working with the palette that they have, whereas if they had her in pink or something along those lines, again, there would have been more of a suggestion of burgeoning sexuality in a 14-year-old girl, whereas the way she's shot in all white or very, very light colored clothes, things that come off as white on screen, she is given such an angelic child innocence in a way that I feel like later on in the 60s, 14-year-old girls are not given. I mean, you even brought up In the Heat of the Night, earlier, and there's a whole subplot in there of like teenage, or I might be confusing that with a different
you're
movie.
right, you're
yeah,
right.
where the teenage girl who undresses in front of windows.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, she's supposed to be like 14 or 15 in that movie, but again, it's later in the 60s and it is in color and it's a movie that's dealing with color. This movie is not dealing outright with it being real life in a way that I think like the black and white nature of the film really, really drives that home.
You brought up Hitchcock, which I think is fascinating because Psycho comes out 2 years before this, right? And
Mm-hmm.
kind of kickstarts the idea of psychosexual horror being something different. You get Peeping Tom, I think, right around that time as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're starting to see a lot of these directors and really film start to talk more about the hyper violence of not just the world, but specifically sexual violence. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Peeping Tom is the story of a photographer who is penetrating, women with a tripod, a tipped tripod. Psycho, we know, is very much this kind of incestuous type
Mm-hmm.
of narrative, and Norman Bates.
You don't get stabbing unless sex is involved.
Exactly. And in the book, at least Robert Bloch's version of Psycho, Norman Bates is very much even more sexually charged. He collects porn.
Mm-hmm.
He's watching Marion undress and doing untoward things to himself. And all of this is being reflected in film. And what's funny is the original novel of the Executioners, the characters are in the military.
Yeah.
So I think like he's Lieutenant Sam Bowden, and of course Max Cady is similarly a soldier in the army, and they made a thing that they couldn't do that. They couldn't besmirch the military in that way, and so they just change it to removing that element. And I thought that was funny that was more of the concern right away than that the fact that the whole movie is essentially about rape.
And underage girls specifically.
Yes.
Like the girl that Max is caught by Sam sort of in the before times is a teenager, and then he's actively stalking a 14-year-old girl throughout the entire movie. So it's not even, age appropriate. It's statutory predatory rape, and it's really screwed up.
Yeah, and what's funny is the word is never used, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even without Nancy, the fear of the trial.
Yes,
And
that is such a deftly written scene. The
Yeah.
way that they dance around the word, and even any sort of technical or medical term for body parts, they know they can't say that on screen. And watching Gregory Peck deliver his monologue about how she would have to go through like medical documents, and so you're immediately thinking of clinical terms for body parts and how humiliating that would be for a 14-year-old girl. And because it's Gregory Peck, and fortunately we're now watching this how many years later, and we know Gregory Peck's own politics, that he did not separate from the products, the projects that he took on, to know that he was really probably struggling with not being able to say, like, the man is a rapist and he wants to rape a kid. Like,
yeah, and I think that's one of the more nefarious elements of Max Cady in this film that becomes literalized in the Scorsese film. Is that in the 62 version, at least, Max Cady's whole thing is like, I'm going to commit rape on your child. And that's the thing. He's very explicit about that. I don't care about your wife. That's ancillary. I'm going to assault your child. And the fact that he knows, Sam says, he knows that I'm not going to put her through that. So she'll just have to live with it, and I'll have to live with the fact that this is what has happened. I think that's the real nefarious, horrific element of his plan, is that understanding that the system forces people to forces women, and in many cases to relive the trauma of what has happened to them. Yeah.
And I think they do a really excellent job with Max's sort of pseudo girlfriend character, who's played by Barry Chase, the character of Diane Taylor, whom he physically assaults. He beats her up and also sexually assaults her in this really low rent apartment. And they all know it's happening and they can't do anything to stop it. And after he flees, you have Telly Savalas's character of the private detective, who I would love to get into at a certain point, basically going, you need to tell us that this happened because we can put him away for a really long time. And Max had already made an allusion to the fact that the character of Diane had come from money. And so he makes a reference to, tell me about the time when you were the veiled prophet queen. And if you know anything about the veiled prophets from St. Louis, this is a coming out debutante ball that is basically attended anonymously by all of the women of the richest, rich families in St. Louis. We're talking bankers, we're talking railroad tycoons, we are talking just unbelievably rich people. And so for her to have been the veiled prophet queen means that Diane is really slumming it by being wherever she is in South Georgia and hooking up with Max. And Max is like, I get to humiliate this debutante who has all this power. And when she gets assaulted, and when he does that to her, she has to suffer with the fact that she can't tell anybody because it would remove her from society in St. Louis to go on the stand and tell everybody how she met Max, who he is, and what he did to her. It is such an incredibly powerful scene, and Barry Chase is so good in it that your heart just breaks for this woman. And she's in the movie all of 6 minutes?
Yeah, what does she say at one point? Like, she can't get any lower than him. Like there's this real kind of concept of the bad boy that she's attracted to.
Gotcha.
Between them than anything else. I could be wrong about that, but that sequence, the Ileana Douglas version in the Scorsese cut, far more violent. I think he breaks her arm at one point, and you watch, like, you see it. It's really, really just like several minutes of watching Robert De Niro just like wail on this woman. It like bites her face. It's a lot. It is a lot. And I think that what J. Lee Thompson does is work with this minimalist style of fear. It's just Barry Chase and Robert Mitchum running around on the bed. Like that's it. And he's shirtless. Again, this is a room that no doubt they've had sex, consensual sex up until this point. But the threat of it now becoming non-consensual, and the fact that the intimidation, the way the camera frames his masculinity.
Yeah, this movie
you do a lot with a little.
Has an absolutely wildly progressive concept of sex and consent for being made in 1962.
Yeah.
It tells you in the text that in 1962, Diane Taylor can choose to have sex with Robert Mitchum's Max Cady and then at any point in the night, remove that consent, and then she is assaulted and the victim of a crime. People can't even grasp that now. You know?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, what did you expect? You invited him up to your room. And she's like, he raped me and beat the crap out of me. That was not consensual. That was not what happened. But she also knows that she's living in 1962 and she can't say jack to anybody. And
exactly. You know, we were talking about class. You talked about class earlier, and I think that that's something else this movie is very progressive about. Again, without making it a thing. You know, the fact that Barry Chase's character has a classist mindset. And then there's also the class elements of Sam and Max Cady. You know, this is taking place in Georgia, but it's clearly a more upper middle class side of it. They have a boat, you know.
That house is palatial. That house is impressive.
And Sam Bowden is, I think, the ultimate example of the halcyon 1950s. You know, he's got wife, daughter, dog in the front yard. It's literally a collie. Like,
like, it's interesting that in the book he also has a son, but they remove him for the movie. Which now I really want to read the book because McDonald is a really interesting writer. He's one of the best-selling authors in American history, and I don't think most people could probably pick him out on a shelf. Like he wrote the Travis McGee series, which was like 50 mystery novels with Travis McGee. Like, he's an incredible best-selling author, and like I don't think most people could ever pull him out of a lineup. But
no,
that's a non sequitur.
Up until I started researching this movie, I had no idea who he was. So I'm glad you're dropping the knowledge on him, because I knew next to nothing. But the fact that Gregory Peck's character, perfect guy, he's fighting, and let's in To Kill a Mockingbird, so again, playing an attorney,
Yeah, he's a fella who knows his type, and fortunately for Gregory Peck, his on-screen type really did match up with who he was as a guy, which doesn't often happen. Like, I think Robert Mitchum, probably way cooler than most of the characters. I mean, he was a little crappy, but like probably way cooler than most of the outright sociopaths that he's best known for playing on screen. But Gregory Peck, like, man, that man had a career that lined up with his aims and goals. That guy was so freaking cool.
Yeah. I want to put a pin in Gregory Peck and come back to him. The fact that he's kind of this established example of Americana, and then you have Max Cady, you have Robert Mitchum too. I mean, Robert Mitchum also came with a whole host of baggage, had been arrested by the police for smoking pot with two ladies of the evening, and went to jail for it.
He apparently didn't want to film in Georgia because he had been arrested for vagrancy in his youth and put on a chain gang. Like, what in the neoclassical times are we living in with being put on a chain gang? Robert Mitchum.
I love Robert Mitchum. Again, if you have not read his memoirs, his biography, it's worth it to read it because it's got a lot of stories. So I think that him playing this role was also playing on a lot of kind of ingrained persona that he didn't want to do it. I think most also because it's just such a reprehensible character.
Oh, he's evil.
And the only reason he accepted was because J. Lee Thompson and Gregory Peck gave him flowers and a case of bourbon.
I love that. I love that so much. But I really appreciate the casting of Robert Mitchum so much because, I mean, he's a babe, and you and I both love him, like, on screen. He's really weirdly compelling in the most, like, dirty and horrible way that, like, whenever you're on screen, you're like, you're up to no good, Robert Mitchum. But one of the things that I do really, really love about this movie, and you have alluded to it, and that it's all about his physicality. And again, like, we talk a lot about the male gaze that nowadays in movies and how men represent themselves. And Robert Mitchum is such a man. You know what I mean? He was the quintessential, this is what a man looks like in 1962. He's got the broad chest. He's got 20 pounds at least on Gregory Peck, who's tall and thin, who, is very, no matter how hard he tries, Gregory Peck is always going to look like he went to finishing school or like, where he has a college degree. That is just Gregory Peck. And like, it's wonderfully compelling, but he's always going to look like that. Whereas Robert Mitchum looks like a man who punches like deer carcasses like they do in like Rocky. You know what I mean? Like the training montage where he's like, I'm going to go to the butcher and I'm going to like punch, cows in the meatpacking plant. Like that's what Robert Mitchum looks like. And this movie does such an incredible job of juxtaposing them back. Like, Robert Mitchum is always in like a Panama hat and like safari clothes or like super casual, very hot weather clothes. And Gregory Peck's always in a suit in Georgia. So he was sweating his ass off the entire time. And they just do such an excellent job of contrasting the two men.
Yeah, and I mean the two of them kind of are similar, or at least have some really interesting juxtapositions in their life. I mean, Gregory Peck was born in La Jolla.
Right.
He and his parents divorced when he was 5. He was an only child. He lived a lot with his grandmother. He didn't really believe that he had a stable childhood, very much kind of the setup you would think for a Max Cady, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Robert Mitchum was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Back when he was born of the 1900s, it was not a great place.
Well, and his father was a train worker who died when he was 2. His stepfather was, I think, like a British Army major, and they traveled around a lot, very rough and tumble.
Did people live in?
very rough and tumble background. You know, and I think both him and Gregory Peck had a lot more in common than you would immediately think. And
Didn't they hate each other?
I don't think they liked each other. I think because they had different working styles, you know, and Mitchum, a lot of people didn't like him, you know. I want to say Loretta Young didn't really care for him because Robert Mitchum swore, you know, he drank. He was a hard drinking, hard living kind of guy. And Gregory
Berkeley.
I always think about how when Robert Mitchum did, I think it was Rachel and the Stranger with Loretta Young, she had like a swear jar. And like she was gonna donate the money to like the children's home or something, and Robert Mitchum at the beginning of filming just gave her like $100 and was like, deal with it. I mean, you know, very taciturn type of guy. But I think that's what works for both of them, and it's such a great example of the differences in their personas because Gregory Peck would come to be synonymous with truth, justice, and the American way outside of being Superman when he does Atticus Finch a couple months after this. This came out in June, in 62. I think, To Kill a Mockingbird comes out November, December of 62. Play a lot of villains. See him play a rapist as well. I mean, he plays...
What a crime to continue revisiting. Thanks, guys.
And then he wouldn't do it again until Boys from Brazil in the 80s, playing Mengele, which that movie is just silly and ridiculous, but it's also worth watching just once.
True.
Whereas Mitchum kind of made his bones on playing kind of horrific people.
Slime balls.
You know, exactly. But there's always this air of just sexual aggressiveness to him. Even in something like when he's, you know, playing the preacher in Night of the Hunter, you know, like Shelley Winter's character in that movie is thinking she's married a man, like it's gonna be great. And he uses that sexuality against her, you know, the film, because he didn't know any other way to do it. And I think that all of that comes to bear in this movie, and their dynamic in the fact that they did not get along, I think really does lead to some really excellent chemistry between the two of them. Because that's the joy of watching their cat and mouse, is the fact that, like, Sam Bowden is a guy that's, you know, you kind of know a lot about him without really knowing about it. You know, he's married to this woman that he seems to care about what their sexual situation is. They have one child.
You know, I was impressed that it's noted that they sleep in the same bed.
That's very true.
That was something I actually was like, whoa, she didn't get up from the twin bed next to her. She wakes up and he's missing from a queen size bed. And I was like, ooh, saucy.
And I think, too, the fact that Gregory Peck looks so physically intimidating. You know, he's super tall, and yet the movie tells us that because he's a good man, quote unquote, you know, he's not using that physicality to lord over. Whereas Robert Mitchum's character is about, like, physical, you know, masculinity, like
chest puffing, like
chest puffing when he's like playing around like with his pants to like strip in front of all the guys. You know, there's a real peacocking element to this performance.
You know, one of the most interesting things about this movie, to me, was that at any time that they did actually confront each other, because they do confront each other many, many times throughout the film, Gregory Peck's character always loses. He is always looking like a daffy, sort of like yellow-bellied, like weakling compared to Max Cady. You know, Max makes all of these sort of like sly, sort of underhanded, you know, double entendre, double speak kind of threats against him. And, you know, Sam doesn't really get any of them off the top. He really thinks that Max is talking to him in honest, plain speak. And it's like, man, he is making so many references to wanting to hurt your kid, and you don't get any of them. Like, how dumb can you be? And then when there's the confrontation scene where he throws a punch at him, and, you know, Sam catches Max ogling his daughter on the boat, and, you know, but they're in public, so, you know, he has every right to be there, and he goes to throw a punch at him, and it's the most pathetic attempt to sucker punch a guy that you've ever seen. And Max is so debonair in that scene. He's wearing like sort of this French boat shirt and white pants. And he's just kind of like, yes, I belong at the yacht club just as much as you do. And Gregory Peck throws this pathetic little punch like he's never been in a fight in his life. And then Max is just like, you are so pathetic. And at that point, he really is.
There really is this dichotomy, I think, in the movie between, and it's something that I think we've seen kind of perverted now in society in America, which is the idea that being a good guy doesn't always get you anywhere. Like, you have to be willing to be violent in some instance. You know, like Law and Order in this movie does not work on their side, right? If anything, Max Cady skirts those loopholes and works in those gray areas, and there's a lot of gray in the law, you know, that this movie is showing us that can't be done. And so at a certain point when Sam has to respond in kind, he hires other guys to go and beat him up. You know,
with a bike chain.
Exactly.
I was like, dang, that is some old school street justice.
And the third act really is about Sam trying to discover his masculinity through brutality, and that would become something that continues on in film into the 1970s. I think of something like Dustin Hoffman in the original Straw Dogs. You know, so there's this real weird look at the changes in being a man. That, you know, poor Gregory. And let's also talk about the fact that you brought up Telly Savalas. The original Max Cady, he auditioned for it, and he was screen tested, did not get the role.
Yeah, doing the cast roll, you know, the pre-roll while like their opening credits, there were two people that I was really surprised to see in the cast, and I had no idea how they were going to be used. But Telly Savalas as the private eye, Charlie Severs, and Martin Balsam as Mark Dutton, the chief of police. And I was like, holy cow, like this cast is incredible. And both of those guys are playing characters that are really, really necessary to all of crime fiction. And they are always, and they recognize this in the movies, is that they are always butting heads. And so you have the chief of police who is supposed to be the guy who represents all of society. And, you know, at this point in the 1960s, kind of like how they wouldn't let the two characters be in the military, the cops, because of the Hays Code, always had to be seen as forthright, stand-up guys of the law. And they do actually a really good job where Martin Balsam is talking with Gregory Peck. And, you know, he's trying to say, like, you can't arrest a guy for thoughts he has. You know, I know he says he's been threatening your daughter, but like vaguely, obliquely threatening your daughter. We can't arrest him for that until he does something. And this movie is having an incredible struggle with the limitations of the law and how good prison actually is for people, which again, for 1962.
I will say I'm very happy that, of course, Telly Savalas does not have the Robert Mitchum role.
I mean, Telly Savalas is great in this.
And Telly Savalas is great in this, but I think having him play Max Cady, that's true too. You know, it doesn't work, but he does some really great work in the part that he's got. You know, I think if there's a weak spot in the casting for me, I'm going to be controversial. It's young Laurie Martin as Nancy Bowden. Who I feel like all of her lines are dubbed. I don't believe they are, but she just sounds like all of her lines are dubbed. Like, it's a very like twee precocious teen girl accent that she's got going on. J. Lee Thompson really wanted Haley Mills to do it. She said she was unavailable. The story I had always heard was that this was as she was starting to do Disney films, and the fear was her playing like a rape victim on the verge.
Yeah, that contract would have been yoinked real fast.
Would not have worked out. So she did not do it. And honestly, you don't really need a name actress. Yeah. She's the victim. It's the one thing that it's the one issue I take with Scorsese's take on it is that he cast Juliette Lewis in 1992, and it very much plays up the nymphette type of element to her. There's a little bit of flirtation and grooming between her and Robert De Niro's character that I just don't think is aged particularly well.
I think there's a way that you can sort of touch upon a 14-year-old burgeoning into their sexuality and receiving male attention and not really knowing what to do with it and perhaps playing into it or playing with it. Do I think necessarily that Martin Scorsese is the right guy to take upon that nuanced conversation?
No, and the actress is fine for what you need her for. She is the victim. She is constantly kind of vaulted up.
Yeah, I thought she looked a little young, to be honest with you.
I appreciated that, though, because I think we live in a world where we always see, 18, 19, 20-year-olds playing teenagers.
That's very true.
I appreciate that she does look like a 13, 14-year-old girl.
Yeah, she looks like a kid.
Yeah. And I think that that's the real horror of Robert Mitchum's character is the way that he has no compunction. This is a movie where Robert Mitchum using the word juicy.
Yeah.
Just you're just like, oh God, stop
this
saying
skinny
sounds.
little kid. Oh, it's so revolting.
It's so bad. And I think that that's where the third act to me becomes all sorts of confusing and horrifying to a female audience, especially, you know, because Robert Mitchum is such an attractive guy. There is this, and yet you're also watching, and I think there's also something that's supposed to be erotically charged about how overt he is about sex in this time period. There's a sequence where he calls their house and he's talking to Polly Bergen's character, the wife Peggy, and you don't hear his conversation. He starts to say something and you're not clear what he's saying, but the look on her face is just like horrifying. And I remember watching this as a college student, kind of being like, I'm repulsed. Like,
I think one of the most to me, I think that Polly Bergen as Peggy is she does a lot with a role that's really crappily written.
Yeah.
She is constant. Like, there's a moment in the movie where Sam realizes that his daughter is gonna get stolen, and he's just like, he is scared out of his mind, and you'd think that her mother would be too. And she seems on the surface to be thoroughly freaked out that her daughter is gonna be kidnapped, like in the way that we were all terrified of being kidnapped in the 1980s and 1990s. Like, we were all, and partially probably to blame for this movie, because we were all terrified that we were going to be stolen by some guy in a crappy old Oldsmobile and be taken away. And that was just like,
we wish Robert Mitchum was at the wheel of that Oldsmobile, by the way. Okay.
Seriously, it never was. It was always with some guy who smelled like cigarettes. But like, she's instructed by her husband that she has to pick her daughter up at school every single day in order to do anything to guarantee that this girl will not be kidnapped, raped, and probably murdered. And the woman decides that at some point it's more prudent than just sitting in her car and waiting for her kid to get out of school to go shoe shopping. She just disappears around the time.
Ladies be shopping, okay?
And, she comes back with a box of shoes and she's like, oh no, what happened to my daughter? And then she finds her hit by a car a block away after she has been chased and tortured by Robert Mitchum. And you're just kind of like, man, they did not talk to a lady when they wrote this, because that's ridiculous.
This is a guy that has killed their dog.
Mm-hmm.
And
poisoned it with strychnine.
Yes, and has already made threatening, obscene phone calls and all these other things. But no, I guess we're not taking that seriously. Polly Bergen, I think, is good. This was her first film. I think she'd been off the screen for 8 years.
Yeah,
and this was a bit of a comeback for her.
She acts the hell out of it. It's just the writing of the character is really bad. It's again one of those ones where it's just like, I'm just a helpless woman. You're just like, you're on a boat. Like at some point he's got her like pinned up against like a wall of glassware in the kitchen of this houseboat that they're on in the Act 3. And I was like, girl, take a glass and smash him in the head. Take a glass and smash him in the head. Do anything to fight back at any point. And she's just like, nah, he's rubbing eggs on me. And it's gross, but he's just rubbing eggs on me, and I guess you're going to let him. Like,
the egg
come
scene,
on.
the egg scene is fascinating. It was completely improvised,
Yeah.
pretty much. And I think that that's the moment where the movie just really does like bring everything together. You know, the third act is Gregory Peck thinking that, oh, we'll take my wife and daughter to the Cape Fear River, which, you know, Gregory Peck did not like the title The Executioners. He had been to the Cape Fear more frightening. If you were a millennial. But he takes them to this houseboat, and Robert Mitchum, of course, Max Cady shows up there. And I think that that's that moment where everything, the cinematography, the direction, the acting, all of it comes together, because he shows up, he's soaking wet, he's got no shirt on, which I do love that, you know, in the 1960s, I think Robert Mitchum was one of the few people to embrace that he had chest hair.
Yeah.
A lot of smooth boys back in the day. But I mean, he is the example, I think, of like when people think to be like a raper. You know, yes, Robert Mitchum is a glow up, I think, but he's also that open sexuality, that open intimidation. He's not hiding anything. This is what he's going to do. And he goes to Peggy, and I talk about the writing for her being so weak, but the way that in it, I don't know if he improvised the dialogue, if those lines were written out for him, but his whole thing is that he's like, well, you're going to offer yourself to me, and I'm going to assault you, but it's going to be consensual because you're going to say yes. And then at some point in the future, I might come back for your kid, but you can make it easier on yourself by offering yourself up. And at a certain point in the scene, Thompson told a crew member, you know, bring me eggs. And that's when Mitchum starts, you know, rubbing the eggs on Polly Bergen. And, you know, that was, her reaction was real. You know, he's breaking them. He's rubbing the yolk on her.
Eggs.
He's throwing her around. She had back problems after this because he's throwing her around counters and whatnot. And I think that for me, in a movie that talks around assault and doesn't use the words, but is always hinting at it, sexual assault, in the way that he is passing along, there's fluid involved, the egg yolks, the way that the eggs are being broken, the way that she's being thrown from place to place like it's a sex scene. I mean, it is shocking. You know, the British censors had more of an issue with the film than the US, and I think they made him cut about 5 or so minutes from the movie, and I have to wonder if it's all in this sequence, because it is the most overt implication of rape.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about that is that you probably know that if she was an actual mother and in an actual, she had been wondering if bargaining was going to work. You know what I mean? And for him, you know, the whole movie, they say he knows how to play the game. He steps ahead of everybody, and he's already bargained out her sexual assault. He's going like, you're probably going to suggest, why don't I just have sex with you and you can leave my daughter alone? And he's like, and to have, you know, especially because it plays with, you're gonna have to put so many trigger warnings on this before I release it, but it plays with also that still existing American myth that all rape or sexual assault is because someone jumps out of the bushes at you, you know, clocks you over the head like a caveman and takes you back and sexually assaults you, which is not the case. As we all know now, statistically, sexual assault and rape is almost always done by someone that you know, and under really bad conditions. And so this movie, again, decades before we've really had this conversation in the, you know, since probably the mid early 2000s, you know, where we really had an online push of women talking about the truth of what sexual assault actually is. This movie is actually going, no, let me mess with your concept of rape and consent and what is allowable under the law. for me to get away with leveraging power against you. And it's a terrifying scene to know that also, like, that scene, the hell out of that scene. And it's terrifying. And to know that she's stranded on a boat, no one's around to hear her scream. If she jumps in the water, I don't know, there might be alligators, or at least there's spiders or disgusting. There's like, it really also plays setting it in a swamp in Georgia or like, North Carolina. Really also to me, when Mitchum kind of slinks into the water, it reminded me so much of Apocalypse Now, where I was like,
Yeah.
oh, and America also has this incredible weight of thinking about Vietnam and jungle warfare on their brains. Even in 1962, it wasn't really at the forefront yet, but they know it's happening. And playing on that with the visuals in this movie too, and to be like, what do you do when you're in a wild, lawless place and there's a predator coming to get you? Like, this the end scene again, like the fight scene with Gregory Peck and all of that at the end is like whatever, but leading up to that, the tense nature of the sexual assault scene and being on the boat, and what do you do with your little girl who's left alone in this wild, oh my gosh, it's like it's perfect writing. It is perfect writing.
You're right in saying that the eventual confrontation between Max and Sam is almost irrelevant, and I think that that's what the movie ends on, this note that, regardless of Max Cady going to jail, he does not die at the end. He is left to have the system place him back in a cage, hopefully forever. The reiteration that thing. But at the same time, the horrors that have been bestowed on his wife and child will forever alter things.
You really hit on something earlier when you were talking about like the changing concept of that violence makes masculinity. And so I think in the end that if Scorsese had left it with, he would have been abdicating some of his masculine responsibility to his wife and daughter if he didn't kill the guy. Whereas, in this, it is seen as being a progressive or advanced state of maleness to not beat him to death with your own hands or shoot him in the head at a point blank range. Sam is really shown as being a more modern man by allowing the courts to take the final act of punishment away from him. Whereas by 92, I feel like we've already circled back to, and it is your true duty as a father to like
kept saying 91 or 92. It's actually 91. In the remake, I think also forces more of a definitive end, good triumphing over evil. The end of the 91 film is the boat is sinking and Sam cuffs Max Cady to the boat. So again, you get that Law and Order element to it, and Max Cady speaking in tongues goes down with the ship. And the original movie ends with because Juliette Lewis's character is narrating the film, talks about how they never spoke about the ordeal, at least to not to one another. And again, I have a real issue with that. The concept of like having to kind of push that down, especially for a woman, and not acknowledge what has been done to you. I think that's, again, not the best way to go. The ending of this.
Because the original book, I was screwing it up. The original book ends with Sam basically taking a flying shot into the yard as Max is running away and manages to shoot him and kill him. And you're just kind of like, okay, it works. But, at least like, it, having the 91 version and the original book end with Sam ultimately killing Max Cady and taking him out of the world is such a really interesting cyclical concept of masculinity that the 1962 version really wants to be sort of, no, it's not the ultimate end of your role as a father, your 1960 thing to say.
Yeah, it's funny that the reviews for this, even the critics didn't really know what to make of it, Bosley Crowther said that this is, quote, "This is really one of those shockers that provokes disgust and regret." And Variety pretty much called the film competent and visually polished. The movie was not a commercial success. Melville Productions, Gregory Peck's production company, ended up going belly up, and wouldn't really matter in a couple of months when To Kill a Mockingbird comes out and gets, Gregory Peck the Oscar and all the accolades that it got. And I think that a lot of that turning away from it is because the movie is ahead of its time.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that people were not ready to have a frank conversation. It's one thing to have Norman Bates hiding his mom in his house, and maybe sleeping with her corpse. It's another to have, however long this movie is, an hour and 46 minutes, rape.
Yeah. No, all I could think of while watching this was, it's not actually a far-fetched scenario that a man would essentially stalk a little girl, in order to commit crimes against her. We know it happens. And all I could think of while watching this was, if the Hays Code hadn't existed, this movie would have been much better received, because I feel like, this is not a controversial thing to say, but denying, the psychosexual nature of a lot of crime for 30, 40 years really gave people this really false and ridiculous sense of security. So when you do start having the 1960s and the 1970s kind of go whole hog into discussing basic but reprehensible human depravity, it was so shocking and so surprising that movies like this were just like, everybody's acting like you turned over a rock and found a dead squirrel. And it's like, no, like, your audience is living this, believe it or not. Like, 14-year-old girls have been preyed upon since the existence of 14-year-old girls. That is just one of the things that happens to 14-year-old girls. And if we had had more movies discussing that, like, this happens and here's what your family should do to protect you, and the law, being paraded onto the stand, and having to give this sort of humiliating testimony, and you can not humiliate the victim of a crime and not treat her like she did something. Like, imagine if this movie had not been considered like a hot potato and instead just like a very insightful concept of sexual violence, which is what it is.
100%. Well, listeners, let me know what you think of Cape Fear, the original, the 91 version, or the TV show. There is a TV show out now. Javier Bardem is playing Max Cady. Patrick Wilson is playing Sam Bowden. Amy Adams is playing the Polly Bergen character. I have not watched it, but I would like to. So I will let people know as I get into it which versions hold up. I'd love to thank Emily Edwards, awesome former co-host of Ticklish Biz, for coming back into the
to talk about this one, because I loved this movie. Like, I really just sunk right into it. So it was so good to talk about it with you. I am absolutely everywhere across social media platforms at Ms. Emily Edwards and at msemilyedwards.com. If you do like the sound of my voice, and I hope you do because you listened to it for 2 straight years, I have a new show called Silver Screen Sleuths, where I discuss mystery and thriller. I trip over the name of it constantly. You can find anywhere where you listen to shows. You can find Silver Screen Sleuths. I link to it. And that's all of it. It started just a couple weeks ago. So we've got a really fun lineup of movies that we've been discussing, and television shows, everything from, Knives Out, Clue, Zodiac, Dial In for Murder, and I've got some television stuff coming up, BBC Sherlock, Mayor of Easttown, all sorts of stuff all over the board, where whole bunch of crime nerds talk about the difference between writing it in a book and writing it on screen.
I love that. Well, we're going from the swamps of Georgia to taking an international trip. That's right. Next month kicks off our International Month series of movies, and I am actually doing International Month dedicated to the listeners. So we are going to be doing 2 episodes based on classic movies that are made in the countries of our 2 most popular non-US listener countries. And we're going to be starting in Australia. I did not realize that Ticklish Biz has such a huge Australian contingent. And we are going to be kicking things off in our next episode in 2 weeks with 1975's Picnic at Hanging Rock. So please come back for that. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Till then.